Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Hope you're doing well, inshallah. We're on chapter 11 of our discussion with the book Defending Muhammad in Modernity by Shaykh Ali Tareen. This is an interesting chapter. It's actually one of the most detailed, in my view, at least, and one of the most difficult to untangle from in terms of the debates, the polemics between the Deobandis and the Barelwis, in particular, Aḥmad Razā Khān. Now, we're not, as always, we're doing a book review, so we're not really making claims as such. We're just sort of describing what the book actually, what the author has to say in terms of his engagement with these authors. So this really comes down to an important discussion around the Prophet's knowledge, right? Ilmul Ghaib. Does Prophet have knowledge of the unknown? Does he have a knowledge of the unknown? What you will have to do in the next few minutes, or even for the duration of this session, is to pay real attention. I'll be extensively quoting from the book itself. The reason being for that is there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of interesting debates that needs to be had, but it needs to be done in a way that's respectful, honest, and tries to maintain some sort of integrity in these debates. These debates continue till today. People still debate these things without much understanding of what was at stake, what texts were involved, what conversations were involved, what was the context of these debates as well. And over the last, 10 lectures, we've been going through a lot of this. So I've dedicated a lot of my time to unpacking this. So the chapter is called Knowing the Unknown, Contesting the Sovereign Gift of Knowledge, right? The gift of knowledge, sovereign gift, i.e. God's gift of knowledge. So Aḥmad Razā Khān and his Deobandi rivals agreed, right? And we should start from here, that knowledge and prophetic authority were intimately intertwined. So they agreed with this. They also agreed on the doctrinal tenet that of all God's creation, the Prophet was the most knowledgeable, authoritative, and beloved. Right. So there wasn't any disagreement on these 2 points. Where they disagreed, where they departed, was on a critical question of how should one define knowledge, and what is its precise relationship to prophetic authority. So how should we define knowledge? What's the relationship with prophetic authority? And so Aḥmad Razā Khān began, and we read in the last chapter, he began to anathematize the pioneers of Deoband, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri, Ashraf Ali Thanvi in particular. And in particular, his effort to take them out of the fold of Islam was based on 2 statements in particular that Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Saharanpuri made on the Prophet's capacity of the knowledge of the unknown, Ilmul Ghaib. So really, it was these 2 scholars who made certain statements, who wrote certain things that made the basis, that set the basis for him to anathematize the Deoband group community, or the Deoband Maslak as a whole as well. And he basically declared them as unbelievers because he felt that the statements they'd made were disrespectful to the Prophet, which we'll go into, and it contravened the necessities of Deen, the Zaruriyat ad-Deen as well. So what we're going to do in this chapter, we're going to go through the content, we're going to go through the context of why he refuted them, and how did certain Deobandi scholars respond to that claim. In particular, towards the end of this video, I'm going to hopefully look at Maulana Manzoor Nu'mani, a very famous Deobandi scholar as well, who died in 1997, who responded, I guess he was a final response in many ways to the efforts of Aḥmad Razā Khān to refute and to anathematize Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri. And this all came down to the whole debate. If you want to really kind of break it down before we go into it, it all came down to this polemic, all came down to the limits of prophetic knowledge. What are the limits of what the Prophet can know? Okay. And as a consequence, because once you start talking about what a Prophet can know and what he doesn't know, then you're by extension, you're also setting limits in terms of the definition. You're defining religion in modernity, right? What I mean by that, we'll talk about towards the end of this video, but that's really important for us as Muslims living here as well, because once you start talking about what the Prophet knows, what he doesn't know, what's religious knowledge, and what's what I mean, what's when you say religious knowledge, do you mean knowledge in terms of salvation? And when you talk about ma'lumat, when you talk about information, that's just worldly knowledge, and that's just knowledge to do with things to do with the mundane aspects, right? To earn a living and so forth as well. So it all comes down to what counts as knowledge. And towards the end of this video, towards the end of this chapter, we have a really interesting discussion which leads to all of this. So these polemics, these debates, while they're sort of historical in some ways, while people still try and maintain that, we still see people on YouTube and other places sort of still debating about these things, I'm more interested in the broader metaphysical or broader meta narratives that are important in all this, right? What do these conversations tell us about how Muslims, whether they're Barelvi or Deobandi or anybody else for that matter, understand religion? Okay. So this is something that's important. Now let's start from the beginning. Okay, so we have the Deobandi scholars like Ahmad Gangoi, Saharanpuri, Thanvi, who basically this whole debate comes from the Mawlid, the Prophet's birthday. That's where it all starts. Okay, and remember, this was the debate of the Qiyam, right? The idea that the Prophet is present when you're celebrating the Mawlid, and the Prophet comes and he's there. And for them, the Deobandi scholars, the idea that the Prophet had the capacity to visit multiple sites and venues simultaneously would lead the masses to think that the Prophet was omniscient. Right? Remember, this was all about guarding the faith, maintaining God's sovereignty, and preventing people from having corrupt beliefs. Right? It was about reform of the masses for the Deobandis. And I think these things are really important, because when people really have these debates, sometimes they're silly debates on YouTube and they go on for hours, they don't understand the context. They don't talk about what happened, what was going on in that world. And I think that's very, very important, right? And any sort of serious scholar would indulge in that. So there was this idea that the Deobandis felt that if you believe that a Prophet is present at the Mawlid, in particular the Qiyam in the Mawlid, then that creates a problem, because you're basically saying the Prophet is omniscient and the masses in particular. So the scholars might be able to rationalize and understand this, but the masses would then begin to attribute divine qualities to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And remember what we said, for the Deobandis, while they emphasize the humanness, the humanity of the Prophet, they also sought to protect the divine sovereignty of God. Okay, and so Abdul Sami, who we talked about later on, who previously, who went about refuting the Deobandis in his book, The Glistening Lights. He's the one I'm going to engage with in the next 10 or 15 minutes, in terms of what was his response. How did he respond to the Deobandi claim here as well? So he chastised the Deobandi ulama for their position that a belief in the Prophet's capacity to visit multiple venues during his birthday is a form of shirk. But he said, look, it's not a form of shirk, right? You're saying it's shirk because it's almost like he's replicating what God can do. And he's saying, well, no, that's not a form of shirk. He counter-argued that this belief that the Prophet could be present at multiple mawlids or qiyams at any one time does not threaten divine sovereignty. It's not a threat to God's divine sovereignty. And Abdul Sami explained that shirk, polytheism, meant associating with a non-divine entity the kind of knowledge that God possesses. Right? We are saying that shirk is saying basically that somebody who's not God has the same knowledge as God has. Okay, and he's emphasizing that, look, knowledge of all the venues where the Prophet's birthday was held could not be compared with God's infinite knowledge. He said this is not the same thing, right? The fact that a Prophet can be there and he has knowledge and he's around all these places, it's not the same thing as saying that he has same knowledge as God. Okay, now God was omniscient. He can be everywhere. He's above all of this. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere. and every moment, on every corner of the entire universe. Okay, um, in comparison to this infinite knowledge of God, a knowledge about the place where the prophet's birthday was celebrated was kind of minuscule. Like the knowledge that the prophet had here was minuscule compared to this omniscient and omnipresentness of God as well. So Sami then argued that a belief in a prophet's capacity to appear in multiple places during the Qiyam simultaneously could not possibly be equated. Um, like you can't equate this with divine knowledge, right? You can't say this prophetic knowledge is the same as divine knowledge. Can you see what's going on here? So he's saying, look, you've said that it's a form of shirk. The Deoband is saying it's a form of shirk because you're basically saying God is omniscient. He's saying, no, we're not saying that. What we're basically saying is that the knowledge that the prophet has is not the same. It's not they're not the same thing as God's knowledge as well. And then he went further, and this is really important. Sami goes further and he says, look, any divine attribute, any sifat of God that was found only in God, like there were certain sifat of God that were only found in God and not anyone besides him. So there were certain attributes that only God has and nobody else has besides God. He says that the capacity to be present in all places at the same time around the world was not among those attributes of God. So we're not doing shirk here. We're not saying that the prophet is sharing these attributes that God has with God. This is something that God doesn't have. That's what he's claiming. And this capacity was not specific to God to be present at all places in the world. Okay, and so he gives the example of the angel of death, that it can traverse the entire universe. Or he gives example of the devil, shaitan, the shaitan's capacity to be present at all places at all times. Okay, so so he's turning it around and turn against the Deobandi ulama and saying, well, if you're negating the same capacity for the prophet, right, that the angel of death can do, and that the devil can do, right? He can be everywhere. He can be many places. Then you're effectively saying the prophet is lesser than the angel of death, or in status, or or even the angel of death, or even shaitan, right? So this is really important, because the logic here is really important. The logic here is what, that by saying that a prophet cannot be everywhere, then you're somehow saying that a prophet is less virtuous than the angel of death and less virtuous than shaitan. Now, that's obviously problematic. So can you see the logic here? Now, these are really important things, and this is something that's very, very academic, and we're going through a study here, so we're not really getting involved in who's right or wrong. We're just laying out the arguments that are being placed here, and then asking bigger questions, right? Not in terms of who's right or wrong, and I'm emphasizing this, but in terms of what do these debates eventually lead to, and how do these debates matter to us as Muslims living today, right? I'm not interested in saying that this group is right, this group is wrong. I'm interested in saying, as in conversation with Yofa, is what does this tell us today? How does this shape our thinking today as well? And so this was the response to the initial claim by the Deobandis, by Abdul Sami. And then the first response that we're going to engage with is Maulana Khalid Ahmad Sahampuri, who wrote a response to these claims that he had made as well. And essentially what he does, before I go into it, is Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri basically separates knowledge and status. He's basically saying ilm and status of the prophet are two different things. The prophet may not have knowledge of lots of things, but that's different from saying he has a lower status. He always has his status, irrespective of whether he knows certain things or not, right? So he's basically separating these two things out, and that's where Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri is going with his response to them, right? And so that's how he gets around this conversation around the devil being more knowledgeable, potentially, or sorry, the devil being in places where the prophet potentially can't be, and somehow then he's better than the prophet or the angel of death in particular. So he begins by saying, look, God has given each of his creation, each of his entities, specific amounts of knowledge. They've all been given specific predefined amounts of knowledge, and to say that any one of them has more knowledge than what God has given to them is a form of shirk, right? So everyone has a certain amount of knowledge. Anyone who has more knowledge than what's God given to them is a form of shirk. This is what Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri is saying as well. And then he invokes a verse in the Quran where Allah says, وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ, that God has the keys to the knowledge of the unknown, and no one except him knows it. وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ, right? God has the knowledge of the unknown, and no one knows it إِلَّا هُ, except God as well. And he says that he further goes, Saharanpuri goes further, and he says the sin of shirk, polytheism, was not limited to equating divine and prophetic knowledge. So he's saying that, look, the sin of shirk is not saying that God's knowledge and prophet's knowledge is the same. Even associating the idea of divine privilege, just as his absolute knowledge with a non-divine entity, was polytheism. Even just saying that the prophet had some sort of knowledge which was similar to God's knowledge was a problem for him as well. And then he cites a Hanafi text, Bahr Ra'iq and Dur al-Mukhtar, where even someone who says, say, for example, someone's doing a marriage contract, they're getting married to somebody, and they say, the prophet and the God are witnesses to this marriage, right? Highlighting the prophet's not there, the prophet's not present. The Hanafi ulama here would say that person is an unbeliever, right? So he's using the Quran, he's marshalling the Quran as a form of evidence, but he's also using the Hanafi school as a form of evidence as well. Remember, while they had differences, they both were very much they expressed fidelity to the Hanafi madhab, right? And that's something to bear in mind as well, because you're implicitly saying that the prophet has knowledge of the unknown. And the crucial point Saharanpuri would have said is that the categorical prohibition against associating knowledge of the unknown with the prophet, right? So the crucial point to keep in mind was a categorical prohibition against associating knowledge of the unknown with the prophet. You can't say that the prophet has unknown knowledge, knowledge of the unknown, just like God would have as well. And so, and then Saharanpuri goes further and he says, all non-divine entities, prophets, the shaitan, the devil, all angels, they all have a specific amount of knowledge, right? A specific capacity, which is called wus'at, for knowledge, and they can't go beyond that. So everybody has a specific amount of knowledge and they can't go beyond that. That's what Saharanpuri is saying is here. And then he also brings conclusive texts from the Quran and from the Prophet and from the tradition, which for him substantiates that the Prophet had knowledge of the unknown, right? So the Prophet wasn't able to access knowledge of the unknown as well. So he's made this claim that everybody has fixed amount of knowledge and no one can go beyond that. He's brought a verse from the Quran in, he's brought Hanafi text in, he's also using hadith, right, of the Prophet ﷺ to say, look, there's limits to the knowledge of the Prophet, peace be upon him, as well, from his own statements. And for him, the critical flaw in Sami's hermeneutics, Saharanpuri would say, was his inability to differentiate between status and knowledge. And this is a crucial point for Saharanpuri, that he didn't differentiate between the status of the Prophet and the knowledge of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Prophet was more privileged than the devil. He was more privileged than the devil. He would say he had greater privileged status than him, but it did not necessarily mean for him that the Prophet was more knowledgeable than him. This is a crucial distinction that he makes, right? So the devil quite possibly can know more than the Prophet, peace be upon him, but in the end, what matters at the end of the day was the Prophet was above the devil or the angel of death, as an example. And this was one of the reasons later on, when Maulana Manzoor No'mani comes into the conversation, he says that this is because the Prophet had knowledge of the mundane. He was a materialist. He had worldly knowledge, which can never even come close to religious knowledge. And the Prophet had sacred knowledge, right? So therefore, even in knowledge terms, he was superior to the angel of death or to Shaitan anyway. But here, Saharanpuri is not making that point. Saharanpuri is simply saying that we need to differentiate between the status of the Prophet and the knowledge of the Prophet. And knowledge and status were not proportional. And he said this was an error that Sami had made as well. And he also said that the analogy that you use, the example that you gave of Shaitan having more knowledge, Shaitan being in more places, that's quite possible for him, or the angel of death can be in many places at the same time, right? If that goes against a conclusive text. And so when it comes to, this is a principle of usul, that when it comes to aqaid, when it comes to points of faith, you don't get involved in analogies, that you believe in what Allah has said, and that's it. And for them, you only need proof text, you only need the Quran. For you don't use analogies to try and understand, to extend them to other ideas, right? So this is something that he made. Now, what's interesting here in Sahranpuri's discussion was that he said something which Aḥmad Razā Khān then caught on to later on, and I'll talk about this in more detail. But he said something that would really remain an important talking point, where basically Aḥmad Razā Khān says, look, he said this shows that they have disrespect for the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I'll just quote in English what the translation says, that he basically says, Satan's and the angel of death's immense capacity for knowledge of the physical world are established from conclusive proof texts, right? So we know this, that they have immense capacity for knowledge, Satan and the angel of death. Then he says this, show me a conclusive proof text that proves such a capacity for the Prophet. Can you see? So if you're basically in the same breath, you're kind of bringing this in. What is it if not polytheism to contravene conclusive proof text with a corrupt analogy, that since a prophet holds a higher status than Shaitan of the angel of death, he must also possess more knowledge than them, right? So he's saying, look, so this for him, Aḥmad Razā Khān, later on, this becomes, he weaponizes this against Sahranpuri later on, right? That, you know, how could you even say this about the Prophet, peace be upon him? So this is important. Now, for Sahranpuri, knowledge was the primary constituting force of sovereignty, and in his view, divine privilege over knowledge of the unknown was critical to maintaining absolute alterity of divine sovereignty. In other words, when you're talking about knowledge, and when we talk about a prophet's knowledge, we differentiate and we say, you know, we maintain this distinction that only God has absolute knowledge, right, nobody else. And then we make the distinction between knowledge and status. Yeah, of course, the prophet might not have a knowledge to the extent that maybe Iblis or someone would have had, but that doesn't diminish him in any way. It's his status that's important, right? He is still a great prophet in any way. So in his discourse, going back to our point again, God had gifted all of his entities a fixed proportion of knowledge. Everybody's been given a fixed proportion of knowledge, and the capacity of all non-divine entities, anyone else besides God. And this was something that God had given to anybody. So everybody, God had given everybody. So I have a certain amount of knowledge which I can't exceed. I can only learn so much. This has been predetermined by God. And so because of this suggestion that a prophet could visit multiple sites simultaneously during the Mawlid, this was something that was problematic to Sahranpuri. Right? This was really problematic to him as well. That he found heretical the implication that a prophet had exceeded the limits of knowledge that God had gifted to him, and he'd gone beyond, right? This idea, this implication that a prophet could go beyond the knowledge that God had given to him as well. And so nobody, even the prophet for him, was allowed to go beyond what the knowledge God had bestowed upon him as well. And so his entire argument rested on the claim that knowledge and status were not necessarily proportional or even related. So these were two separate things, knowledge and status. Okay, this move was very clever because this allowed him to venerate the prophet, because by saying, well, he has a maqam status, and saying that and agreeing with the Barelwis, I guess, and Aḥmad Razā Khān, the prophet is the most exalted human being, right? But at the same time, he can humanize him as someone whose knowledge was less than of Shaitan or angel of death. Right? So can you see this discourse that we've talked about in previous lectures? This idea of making sure that we don't get into areas where we contravene the sovereignty of God, but at the same time we emphasize the humanness of the prophet, peace be upon him. This obviously had some issues, which I won't go into in detail, but it's mentioned in the book as well. Now, the next person who responds to in the Deobandi community to Aḥmad Razā Khān is Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi. And he has a book, a small book called Hifz al-Iman, Guarding the Faith. And then he goes into this hypothetical debate in response. And he says, if a question is said, for example, that Zayd, somebody called Zayd, say that knowledge of the unknown is of two kinds. If somebody said to you that knowledge is two types, knowledge of the unknown is two types, one that's essential, is that like essential knowledge, and the second is mediated knowledge, like you get to know it through somebody else. So someone asking this question, right? These two types of knowledge. He argues that while the first type is reserved for God, the second is available to the Prophet. So knowledge of absolute, knowledge of essential things is reserved for God, but in terms of knowledge through mediums, Tanvi would say that can be attributed to the Prophet as well. So the Prophet. So the question is, if we say that there are two types of knowledge, one is knowledge of essentials, which is attributable to God, and then we say knowledge bil wasta, mediated knowledge, these types of knowledge, and we say one is for God and one is for the Prophet. Can we then call the Prophet the knower of the unknown? Can we then say, if we demarcate it this way, can we then say the Prophet does have knowledge of the unknown? Is this interpretation correct? And Tanvi responds to this question that's been theoretically asked to him, that what if we do it this way? Like, what if we differentiate between essential knowledge and knowledge that's acquired through means? And can we then say that the second type of knowledge is, i.e. through means, is a type of knowledge which we can call a Prophet as someone who has knowledge of the unknown? Right? This is how he responds. And so what Tanvi does is he decisively rejects the possibility that the Prophet could be called the knower of the unknown. He says, look, you can't even do this, right? And he says that attachment is titled to any of God's creation can lead to polytheism. This can lead to shirk as well. And he says that he further argues. So, for example, it was for the same reason he says, for example, that referred to the Prophet as Ra'ina, our shepherd, or our Rabb, my Lord, was prohibited, right? We don't want to go down that route because it leads to polytheism. And he also states that apart from revelation, proof from revelation, which shows that the Prophet had partial knowledge. Okay, the Prophet's own career. So we find in Hadith, we find many examples where the Prophet had partial knowledge. He didn't know about many things as well. For example, he gives the example: the Prophet uses spies and informers to gather intelligence. Okay, so how can he be called knower of the unknown? If he had known this, why would he have used people to do his bidding for him? He could have just known himself. So he says, look, we know that the Prophet had partial knowledge, and this is where Tanvi brings his arguments as well. But again, like Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri, Tanvi says a few things, makes a few statements, which Aḥmad Razā Khān later on really latches onto, right? And the author calls this satanic philology because they're using shaitan to sort of, in the same breath as when they're talking about the Prophet. So I'll quote this again from Tanvi's discussion on it. He says, if one accepts that it is correct to attach the title knower of the unseen to the blessed being of the Prophet, then the question that must be asked is, what kind of hidden knowledge is intended here? Absolute or partial? If you say that is partial hidden knowledge, then that's nothing specific to the Prophet. Every boy, and this is where it gets problematic later on, this is where Aḥmad Razā Khān really picks up on, is every boy, lunatic, in fact, even every animal beast knows something that no one else knows. So if you're saying that he has partial knowledge, that's nothing special to the Prophet, because everybody has partial knowledge. Okay, therefore, if one followed this logic, all these entities should then be called knower of the unknown. You should also call them knower of the unknown as well. And if you intend the former, which is absolute knowledge, then this goes against rational and revelatory proof. Right? You can't say the Prophet had absolute knowledge. So can you see? Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri distinguishes between knowledge and status, and Tanvi is basically having a slightly different discussion, a slightly different response, but it's the tone and the manner in which they respond to Aḥmad Razā Khān, which really becomes in the next section something that's really, really important, right? Because they're basically in the same breath, they're sort of using animals and other non-divine entities that are lesser than the Prophet to make their examples. And so this was in both cases, Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri and Tanvi, this was a case of using a provocative analogy, right? And Aḥmad Razā Khān felt that this was disrespectful to the Prophet himself as well, because they use a rhetorical style that would in some ways haunt them, right? And even when you read the books today, they kind of, these are the flashpoints. These are the places where they say, oh, look how much gusta they show towards a prophet, right? When Tanvi talks about partial knowledge, he's comparing it to animals and so forth. When Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri is talking as well, he's talking about shaitan and saying the shaitan has more knowledge than the prophet, and so look how disrespectful they are to the prophet as well. So, and this was because they use, they compare it with animals and beasts and lunatics, for Hazrat Tanvi's case as well. And so because of this is one of the reasons why Aḥmad Razā Khān declared them unbelievers, because these two statements from them contravene the necessities of religion, what I talked about at the beginning of the zaruriyat of deen. And so in his text later on, in Husam al-Haramain, a very famous text, I believe it has been translated as well, he rallies against Gangohi, Saharanpuri, Tanvi as a group of satanic Wahhabis, right? Wahhabiyya Shaitaniyya. And he says, look, you're insulting the Prophet, simultaneously you're glorifying Shaitan. Can you see how this debate kind of moves in very interesting directions afterwards? And he begins his assault on Saharanpuri, and then he moves to Tanvi. And he goes after Saharanpuri because for him the suggestion that the Prophet, God's most beloved subject, might possess lesser knowledge than Shaitan and the angel of death was unthinkable. Right? Remember the thing that Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri was saying, that look, it's possible that he can have less knowledge, but in terms of fadl, the Prophet is always above all of these creation. Right? It says, look, when you're drawing comparisons between the Prophet's knowledge and Shaitan's knowledge, this confirms for him an attitude of irreverence, an attitude of disrespect towards the sanctity of the prophetic example, right? So it was those statements that they made that Aḥmad Razā Khān really cottoned onto as well. And so Ahmad Razā Khān accused Saharanpuri of calling Shaitan more knowledgeable than the Prophet, but he went further. He argued that there was no substantive difference between calling the Prophet less knowledgeable than a non-divine entity and brazenly cursing him. He said, you might as well just curse the Prophet for all intents and purposes, because once you've said that the devil, for example, or the angel of death has more knowledge than the Prophet, then he says, for all intents and purposes, you've just cursed the Prophet as well. And so for him, he was guilty of sabr Rasul, swearing or insulting the Prophet, and because of that, he deserved to be called a non-Muslim, right, like kafir as well. And then Aḥmad Razā Khān goes a little bit further in his polemic against Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri, and he says that you showed enthusiasm about establishing the devil's capacity for knowledge, and you were militant about denying the same capacity for the Prophet. So these are all rhetorical devices that are being used now as well. While you call the Prophet's knowledge access to knowledge of the unknown polytheism, Saharanpuri found nothing problematic in attributing the same access to Shaitan. Right? Can you see how this is really, really interesting? So that's how he responded to his response to Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri was. What was his response to Ashraf Ali Tanvi in particular? And again, it goes back to the statement that Tanvi made. And he said, basically, you are equating the Prophet with animals and lunatics. Right? And this is disrespectful. Okay? And then he goes further and he says, look, what Tanvi didn't consider was that that the kind of hidden knowledge that all non-prophet entities possess is merely speculative. It's a zanni. Only prophets were the true and original recipients of conclusive knowledge over hidden matters. Okay? And God did enable, didn't enable anyone else, but he did enable some of his prophets, his favorite prophets, to access certain knowledge, he emphasized. So while he's also gone after Ashraf Ali Tanvi because of what he said in a disrespectful way for him against the Prophet, he also made this claim as well. And his major philosophical objection against Tanvi was that he rejected the idea that knowledge served as a mark of privilege, right? He said, why are you saying knowledge is not a mark of privilege? It is a mark of privilege. In Khan's view, knowledge and privilege were hierarchically organized. The more knowledge you have, the more privilege you have, right? Whereas for the Deobandis, you're basically separating knowledge and privilege, and you're keeping them separate. He's saying no, they have a relationship. They have a relationship. One increases, the other one increases. Whereas the Deobandis are separating them out. Can you see? It's really academic discussions, but they're important discussions for us, just to sort of understand and unravel all these things and realize that really, for me and you, the average person, we shouldn't get too vexated with these things. Right? But they're important to know as well in terms of what was the debate, because I've met lots of people in life who haven't really understood these things, but it's used for polemical purposes. Anyway, so he says an entity's capacity for knowledge signified its rank and stature in God's hierarchy of privilege. The more knowledge you had, the more privilege you have. But the moment you sort of decouple these two, then for him it becomes problematic. Whereas for the Deobandis, they were fine with decoupling these because it's possible that these creatures can have more knowledge, but the Prophet is always above them in terms of his virtue as well. So for Tanvi, for Khan, Aḥmad Razā Khān, Tanvi had erased this correspondence, this hierarchy. Right? There was no hierarchy from now on. So that's very, very clear, I hope, for all of us. And rather, for him, there was a hierarchy of knowledge that clearly distinguished more privileged entities, such as prophets and saints, from less privileged ones, such as ordinary humans and animals. So there was a hierarchy for Aḥmad Razā Khān and the Deobandis and the Barelvis in particular. And for Aḥmad Razā Khān, the underlying flaw then in Tanvi's argument was its failure to distinguish between different types of knowledge. Right? And then he goes through some discussion as well. And so Tanvi had basically robbed the Prophet of his exceptional status by constructing an excessively stark binary between prophetic authority and divine sovereignty. Okay, in the way Aḥmad Razā Khān imagined this theology, and this is all about how scholars imagine these things, right? How they can, what are the limits of imagining these things? Much like Fazl Khairabadi before him, for Aḥmad Razā Khān, divine knowledge and prophetic knowledge were mutually constituted. They came together. They came as a package. Whereas for the Deobandis, they strove to maintain divine sovereignty, and while at the same time emphasizing the Prophet's humanness as well. So this was part of a discursive venture. They came together as well. So this is something to bear in mind as well. He was an active participant in divine knowledge for the Barelvis at least as well. And so anyone who undermined the Prophet's aura, his knowledge, also for him was casting aspersions on God. Okay, God's sovereignty and the Prophet's exalted status were not mutually exclusive. They weren't exclusive things. For him, as the Deobandi erroneously assumed, rather they were intertwined. So for him, this is how the debate went. So we've moved from the initial conversation to Khalid Ahmad Saharanpuri and Tanvi, and then we've gone to Aḥmad Razā Khān in terms of his responses to them as well. For him, like, he felt that Tanvi was going beyond the boundaries of thinkability. Okay, as soon as a comparison between the Prophet, lunatics, and beasts became thinkable, as soon as these two scholars in their writings used these analogies, he was basically saying, well, you're thinking now, you're thinking about, you're extending these boundaries of thinkability. For him, it was only a matter of time. It was a slippery slope before the very doctrinal foundations of Islam, such as divine sovereignty, could be exposed to such scandalous comparisons. It's a matter of time before you go for God. It's a matter of time before you go for God, for him, right? So this is how we understand the logic of Aḥmad Razā Khān. So he was, again, in many ways, trying to protect divine sovereignty, right? Just like the Deobandis were trying to protect divine sovereignty, but the method and the way they understood it, the way they imagined it, was very different. Okay, and this is why he went further, and he anathematized the Deobandi pioneers, right? Because he felt that once you go for the Prophet, for him, once you sort of use his analogies and you think to this level about the Prophet, then what's to stop you to extend this to God? And this becomes a threat to religion. This becomes a threat to the faith. Can you see how they sort of imagine this as well? And this anxiety of Aḥmad Razā Khān becomes even more clear when we think about what we talked about in the previous chapters about Inkani Kizm, right? the idea that God can contravene a promise, or imkan nazir, the idea that God can create, God can lie, or God can create another prophet like Muhammad. Remember, Shah Ismail's argument was the distinction between potentiality and actuality. God could lie, but he won't lie, right? And he might enact an exception to the rule, but he won't do it because that doesn't fall within his broader theological, broader vision. Um, and remember what the response was, that if you say that God can't lie, and because human beings and other entities can lie, you're somehow saying that God is lesser than human being. And so this was a way of, again, they were trying to protect divine sovereignty as well. Um, Now, Gangohi goes out to defend Ismail, and he says, look, God does have an ability, capacity to enact an exception, right? He can lie if he wants to, um, but he won't do this. And then Sahranpuri also weighs into this conversation, and he says that the Barelwis are like the modern Mu'tazilites, because the Mu'tazilites, he reminds his readers, they considered it impossible for God to even hold a capacity to reward rather than punish a disobedient person. Right. So if you've done something wrong, the Mu'tazilites would say you're going to hell, right? And God's not gonna show any mercy upon you, or to punish rather than reward an obedient subject. Okay. So the Mu'tazilites had really insisted on, in essence, that God was necessarily just and must be just at all times, right? And he said, well, this is very similar to what the Mu'tazilites believe in. So you're, as Barelwis and the Mu'tazilites, you seem to share a similar theological viewpoint as well. And the Deobandis would respond and say that we're already acting like the Ash'aris, right? We're acting like the Ash'aris before that. God can enact an exception. He can say, well, I'm going to forgive you because that's God's right. However, for Aḥmad Razā Khān, for him, this did not conceal a more deadly discursive agenda, which for him was leading to moral and catastrophe. Okay, because for him, going back to my point before, that the threat of extending the boundaries of thinkability, right, to alarming territories of imagination. If one could, again, going back to the example of the prophet, right, whether he had knowledge of the unknown, if you're extending these to animals and so forth, then you're going to start taking this to God. Same thing, if you can say that God could potentially lie, then what is there for us to believe in about God, right? God is, what about other things, right? Other things become possible to imagine as well then. Okay. And so for him, this became very, very public. For example, religion itself became vulnerable for him, an upheaval. Rewards and punishments in the hereafter, like he's told us about, or resurrection, on heaven, hell, right? None of these transcendental promises that God has made no longer for us is important, right? They don't have any substantive nature to it. And so you can see where Aḥmad Razā Khān was taking this, and you can see where the Deobandi scholars were taking this as well. And I think when you have that clarity, it's really important to once you have the clarity, you can break down these conversations, look at the text, but also look at the context, the debates, what was at stake, and what were their intentions. I mean, they all had the same intention, which was to protect their religion. Ultimately, this was about protecting faith, right? But the way they looked at each other and the way they understood each other was very, very different as well. And so he felt ultimately, Aḥmad Razā Khān, that the speculative discourse of the Deobandis and the doctrinal maneuvers of the Deobandis was verging on blasphemy. Right? You're taking people, you're gonna lead to a lot of chaos as well. However, for the Deobandis, they would say this was a risk worth taking in the stake of securing divine sovereignty in a moment of moral crisis and chaos, right? We need to shut down some of these things. We need to come hard on these things because there's moral crisis and chaos as well. And so the person who really comes to the fore here, and I want to spend some time looking at his ideas, inshallah, is Maulana Manzoor No'mani. And he becomes someone that's really, really interesting. And what I'll do, because this has been a long conversation, I'm going to join this with the next lecture. So in the next video, what I'll do is I'll go through what Maulana Manzoor No'mani has to say in terms of his response to this conversation that we're having so far. I'll do a separate video, so I'll break it up a little bit, inshallah. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.